Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we are going to talk about on our podcast Monty Python. Sorry, I meant Montesquieu. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brède et de Montesquieu. Man's got a hella long name, but his ideas are even longer. He wrote 3 books that are important, only one of which anyone gives a shit about, specifically The Spirit of the Laws. And we're going to be discussing this with one of the leading experts on this subject. Our guest today is perhaps the greatest living philosopher from Latin America. And he does not lag behind at all behind his hero Montesquieu in the slightest, whether that is in academic or his personal achievements. Please join me in welcoming to the studio, Alessandro.
Hello everyone. I am very happy to be here in this pilot episode for this brand new and quite amazing podcast.
Yeah, this is actually episode 57, not just kidding.
Oh, wrong podcast, I'm sorry.
We still don't know what the podcast will be called, but it will eventually get a name.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us in the time span of 10 seconds, a really, really brief summary of everything Montesquieu ever said, starting 3, 2, 1, now.
So there are states, and there are some more correct states for, or political, oh my god, it's difficult in 10 seconds.
We'll get into that a bit more. So,
Okay.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, if I actually had to describe what Montesquieu said in a very brief sentence, it would be something along the lines, even though there are many different ways of doing government, only some are right for some states. Because it's actually quite interesting how he believed that, well, he made this categorization. There are 3 sorts of state types. There are, republics, which we all know and love.
Yeah.
There are monarchies, quite prevalent during his lifetime, and there are, just these despotic states. Now, of course, he gave these names, but in reality, we nowadays know them as different things. I think, especially in the monarchy, we would not actually use the title. We would say more of a constitutional monarchy, which separates him from the despotism, which he believed to be these.
What's the difference?
Yeah, because he believed this despotic states were these rather savage Oriental states that had no rules but the voice of the despot. So essentially, anything that he said was the law. Unlike the more advanced northerner monarchies, where it was like, oh yeah,
Magna Carta.
Yeah, indeed.
For a Frenchman to be praising the British Constitution.
Yeah, but while he does that, he also says a very interesting thing, because essentially Montesquieu said there are different climates in different parts of the world, and climate directly affects which political system should be instituted in the nation. So essentially he said, and he had this entire biological theory as to why this is the case. He said in the more northern states, the cold makes the fibers, so I guess he meant the muscles, of the people shorter and tougher, which made them more insensible. So they weren't as moved by their passions. So they had a more logical and, level-headed type of thought, but at the same time, they were boring as
Anyone who's to Greenland in winter can confirm. There's a reason there.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, exactly. So he said, well, those people are perfect for republics. While, if you go further down south, more to, nearer to the equator, you have, so let's say Northern Africa or very southern Italy. Despotic states are actually a preferred system because the fibers in the body are far looser, which creates far weaker men, and thus they are more moved by their passions, and they need a despot to control the people, how they are governed.
Isn't this something that goes back to the ancient Greeks? I'm pretty sure, I don't remember who it was, maybe Aristotle, who wrote something similar about the northerners went the southerners, and that by no coincidence Greece is right in the middle where it's perfect. And And then
Yeah.
that as well.
Yeah, funny enough, Montesquieu does that as well, just instead Greece or Italy. He says, oh yeah, I mean France and Paris just so happen to be in the middle, in a moderate government.
Anywhere they don't live as being the perfect place.
Yeah, would be nice.
Place, the perfect government emerges in I don't know.
Yeah. The thing is, I feel they will be seen as these crazy revolutionaries and traitors to the motherland or whatever.
Also say that the British government style was like really good, so.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, they were still kind of northern barbarians of sorts.
Barbarians with a
really good constitution.
That seems to be completely ahistorical and geographically deterministic, but that was all the rage at the time.
Actually,
infantilism and
Yeah, something which is very interesting of Montesquieu is to compile his big book, The Spirit of the Laws. He actually took 20 years to do it, and to get his ideas and information. What he did is, he traveled, and he also got a lot of information from what he said, different travels that went to the Orient and to Arabian and whatnot.
What did he?
And from apparently that people in the Orient were prone to despotic states. Well, the thing is, as I said before, he divided these types of government into three. The thing is, each type of this government, and this I think is probably the core of his theory, is maintained by what he called a principle. So he said, republics, and in republics, by the way, he bunched up both democracies and aristocracies. He said they are maintained, or at least democracies are maintained by political virtue, which is a very weird thing. Essentially, it's sort of selflessness and love of the state. Yeah, especially that love of the state, where people are not only, do not only do what they want, but what is best for everybody, what's best for the state, and so on. And it's probably the hardest one to maintain because everyone needs to be really virtuous, like those Roman Republic types that were all in favor of the Senate and whatnot. Then he said, aristocracies, they also need, but it's a little bit different. What they need, their principle should be moderation. Why? Because, even though, the only equality or this only love for the state, it's not as necessary as long as the aristocrats don't believe themselves to be better than the rest of the aristocrats. They have to be moderate in their actions, let's say. Then in monarchies, it becomes a little bit different because in monarchies, all you need is honor. Because the thing is, in the monarchies, you still have a sort of, you have all the nobles and so on. But essentially what you want to do to keep them loyal to the king, because the king cannot do everything that he commands. He needs people to do it for him. The thing is, they have to believe that they will earn honor through doing things that will make the king happy, or that he will believe to be
the correct, course of.
Yeah, precisely.
Is there like an idea of loyalty wrapped up in that conception of honor?
Yeah, precisely. Because essentially what you want to do is you want to avoid them from doing a coup d'etat to the king. He actually, Montesquieu has this very interesting idea where he says each government can become corrupt.
Yeah.
And, the purpose of a government is not to, make everyone happy or anything like that. It's just to keep being the same government for a very long time. And corruption essentially for Montesquieu means erosion of what the government is. So if, you have a republic, it can easily degenerate or, become corrupt and become a despotic state. And it's not bad that it's a despotic state. It's not bad that it's a monarchy, and it's not bad that it's a republic. It's just bad that it changes. That's essentially what you want to avoid, this corruption.
Does he not differentiate? Does he not have a preference for any one of the states?
This is one of the most probably contested topics.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. This is one of the most contested things within Montesquieu, where some authors claim that he didn't have any preference, though, probably the majority say, actually, he had a little bit of a bias for monarchies.
Oh.
Not only because he said, actually he mentioned somewhere in the book that he prefers moderate states. And of course he says, well, what is the most moderate form of government? Oh, of course monarchies, because climate-wise they're in the middle. So, not too hot, not too cold. He also says...
Like a temperature sense rather than a political.
Yeah.
Linked closely.
Yeah, precisely. Also, of course, the people are also moderate, as you mentioned, because they are not, these stoic, really machine-like people, and at the same time, they are not these complete hedonistic southern people either. They are just kind of like in the middle. They are logical enough, but also they're kind of fun. That's kind of like what he thinks of the Frenchman.
There's no surprise that he would say that the French sort of...
Yeah, precisely.
It's sort of a funny phenomenon in generally sort of European way that they think of geography, where if you go to the Netherlands, the people in the north are seen as industrious and logical and cold, and the people in the south are seen as sort of hedonistic, like sort of just live to party people. But then if you cross the border to Belgium, their next door neighbors, also the northerners, are seen as being in the same way, industrious and logical, and the southerners are. Right. And then you go to France and it's the same. So no matter what country you are in, it seems to be that. And
yeah, you're always better.
It seems to reset at the border, which is sort of cute.
Yeah. I don't know how you can escape this bias, though. As an author, you must think, or probably, there is some sort of nationalism that sprouts on you when you're born, or at least when you grow up in certain places where you believe, well, we do things kinda okay in comparison to the rest of the world. Maybe nowadays not so much.
Makes me wonder, for you as a Peruvian, where if a political system is rather, dysfunctional, would you still, do you ever think that, well, at least we're sort of, a bit better than Bolivia or something?
Well, I mean, yeah, but the thing is, I don't think I would say it's a northern kind of thing. It's really, I think, one of the more commonly used indicators in South America is probably just GDP, or how the economy is doing, or how bad your inflation is. Because once you're below what you would, the amount of money that you need for a comfortable life on average as a country, I guess that's one of the most important things. Because, well, you don't really care as much for the political system as much as you care about, well, how will I live until next day? That's something I've thought about. Actually, this is an interesting debate, because nowadays we see democracies being, the end-all be-all of all political systems. Right.
Democracy asserting itself everywhere.
Yeah, precisely. Yet, is this really the case? Because some people, and in some states, they don't care as much for these individual or these core values that we see in democracy, like, for example, liberalism, this idea that you have to be as free as you can within reasonable limits, if you can describe it that way. Some people, just don't care as much. So, for example, if we see Singapore, I think it's a wonderful example, because they are quite despotic in their nature, probably. You have this single party which hasn't changed in I don't know how many years, yet people seem to be quite happy there.
Yeah,
because of various reasons.
It seems to be sort of a technocratic despotism, which to Montesquieu seems like a form of government he wouldn't consider, right? Like, despotism is made for people who are very sort of wild and need a harsh crackdown. It doesn't seem to be the sort of rationalized, how do you make a city-state work in a very small state to make everyone sort of have basic goods.
Yeah, well, but here's the thing about Montesquieu. In theory, or at least the spirit of the laws or the book was written in a way where he kind of tried to divorce himself from saying, well, this cannot work and this cannot work. It's just every single form of government can work.
Okay.
But you just have to match them to the right places. And of course, there are things just like climate, the principles, and something also very interesting, which was quite a common thought until just a couple hundred years back, the size of the state. Because he, at least Montesquieu, along with most, thinkers of the time, thought that smaller states were more apt for a republic. So, for example, let's say just Geneva is a city-state, and that's a perfect republic.
Rousseau was a big advocate of that idea as well, I believe.
Probably he is, actually. Yeah, and then, the larger states must be, of course, despotic because they are too big and you cannot really have this, to make things quick. You have to have only one person in charge, that it doesn't take 10 hours to deliberate on whether you should build a bridge or not. And of course, in the middle...
In most countries.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I get your point, yeah.
And of course, there's the moderate state in the middle, which has to be a monarchy, because of course it's states that are not too big, states that are not too small. So let's say states the size of France, which just so happen to be the perfect size for a monarchy.
And that is the type of government that was in place there at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, that is not surprising, given that he might maybe be trying to avoid trouble with the government by stating that everything should just stay the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, many people think...
A change sort of approach.
Yeah, but yes and no, because the thing is, France in his eyes was changing in a way. He saw this corruption in the state that I mentioned earlier, this erosion. I mean, if he considered France to be a monarchy, then he saw, this idea of honor slowly becoming more corrupt and then changing into a more despotic state where, the law was essentially made by the word of the despot and by nothing else. Nothing constrained him, which essentially he saw, or at least many people believe that's how he saw France at the time. Though it's funny because then his ideas mostly inspired the constitutions of the bigger and the more long-lasting democracies that we see nowadays.
United States.
Yeah, the United States. Because people say, Rousseau influenced these other Enlightenment authors, but when it really comes to it, you see more Montesquieu than any of these guys in the American Constitution.
To my next question, which is that to most people who haven't looked into it as deeply as you, Montesquieu is just the separation of powers guy. And of course, that is something that is very prominent in the American political system. What does he mean by separations of powers? What are those powers, and why does he choose these specifically as being important?
So essentially he saw that there are three types of political powers: the executive, legislative, and judicial. What he wanted to do with the Constitution, or at least the way he saw the English Constitution, which he named, I believe, the Constitution of Liberty, or actually he, more than anything, he saw the Constitution as having the purpose of maintaining this liberty, which I actually have the quote here because it's quite an interesting quote. Right. He believes liberty to be, he says, liberty can only consist in having the power to do what one should want to do and in no way being constrained to do what one should not want to do. Which, of course, has evoked so much analysis because that's such a vague and poetic quote.
Yeah, I it initially.
Yeah, it's essentially a sort of, I think, a bit of a Kantian ideal of, everything that is moral is, or more than anything, everything that is immoral is what no reasonable person would actually want to do. I think it has these ties with reason. But essentially, what he wanted to do with the Constitution is preserve this liberty and avoid this corruption into what he saw, the despotic state. And the idea was to separate this executive, legislative, and judicial so that no one man, or actually at least no one entity, could actually become despotic. And I say entity because he saw democracies as also being able to become despotic. If it becomes a thing of, for example, majority rule, where you have this massive group of people, and assuming they only have one will, directly controlling what other smaller groups, for example.
Like, I guess, direct democracy, which is like a classic, I think, philosophy.
Yeah, kinda. And, well, looking more into the Constitution itself, which actually I think he connected more with probably monarchy, he wanted to avoid, for example, so that no one should have, let's say, legislative and judicial power, where you would essentially be able to say, well, legislative being the power to make laws and judicial to carry out sentences. He wanted no one to be able to say, well, this is the law now, so you should die. And, the
person says, this is the law now, and the other person gets to decide whether they die.
Right, and you didn't want to have, those two things in the same, let's say, governing body. Or, for example, if you have executive and legislative, You could say, well, I want to do this, but the law doesn't allow me, so I'll just change the law, and then I'll be able to do what I want.
Yeah.
And essentially, the idea was to avoid too much power from going to one person or the other, so that despots cannot really arise, and liberty cannot be threatened, at least from one governing body.
Okay. Yeah, that seems to be the basic idea that he's most famous for. Now, that seems to me to be quite, perhaps in a monarchy, which you said is sometimes believed to be his preferred form of government, to sort of not be provided for. Like, to me, in a monarchy, it would appear that a monarch can decide what the law is and then execute it. Or
yeah, but
understand that. How was he? Is there a separation of power in monarchy, or is that more of a despotism in monarchy?
Yes. Because the thing is, in a monarchy, you separate particularly the monarch from the aristocrats.
Mm-hmm.
The aristocrats would be a little bit more, let's call them selfish in a way. The aristocrats would be the people who are more prone to corrupting the government if it comes to it. And the king, he was essentially a protector of the lower people. So essentially, he wasn't one of the aristocrats, so to speak. He was a sort of separate entity which cared for the interest of his subjects.
Sort of a populistic figure, perhaps, or a sort of benevolent dictator.
Yeah, it's almost like an enlightened despot. Just that, not a despot, because there's also, the law, the constitution and whatnot. Yes.
Just because, of course, there are constitutional limits on what anyone can do here. He's a fan of, I guess, institution in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
What do you understand by protecting sort of the subjects?
Oh, essentially that the aristocrats, or not aristocrats, but the nobles, don't do what they want with them. So essentially that they don't exploit them, or if there are liberties in the state, that they don't abuse of them or anything. Because, of course, one would have the legislative and the other one would have the executive power. One would be able to say what should not be done within the state, what a state should regulate, and the other one should be able to say, well, this is what we will do as a nation together. Sorry, what was the question again? I got a little bit lost there.
I also got lost. I don't remember what either. So another thing that sort of interested me is you said that there was two types of republics. One of them is the sort of democracy as we understand it today, and the other one is the aristocracy. In what way is an aristocracy a republic, and without a monarch, how does it avoid degenerating into any of the other forms?
Yeah, well, the thing of the aristocracy is that you still have a sort of, let's call it, state of the many, because in an aristocracy, the aristocrats don't necessarily have to be nobles.
Yeah.
I mean, if you see it through like a sort of Marxist lens, then yeah, probably you would assume that there's a class difference in which the ruling class is different from the governed class or the ruled class.
Yeah.
And also, the way that this aristocracy preserves itself is through essentially moderation. You simply don't want the people who are governing to say, all right, well, today I realized no one can do anything against me. Let's just abuse everyone. You simply don't want that. So essentially you have to have this very strong principle of moderation. Moderation, which Montesquieu said to be his favorite virtue, because he said that he was himself a very moderate man. Interesting, because he was also an aristocrat. So, some people look quite a lot into it. This author, Althusser, I believe he was a French philosopher from the 20th century, wrote a little bit about Montesquieu and came to the conclusion that Montesquieu was essentially just benefiting himself out of writing this entire book, because he said, let's analyze every sort of government and then let's see which political class benefits the most. And he was like, oh, the aristocrats. Why could that be? Montesquieu, you cheeky bastard.
SMH. I wonder, from harking back to something you said earlier about his extensive travels, and I think he did study also non-Western governments. Could you dig into that a bit more and give me, the listeners, an idea of like what his approach and opinions on these were, beyond simply that they are emotional and despotic.
On the Oriental states, you mean?
Yeah, or the ones that he studied. Like, which ones did he study, and how did he come to his conclusions about them, or what conclusions did he come to?
Actually, it's kind of hard to pinpoint which states he did study, but I do think that there are some hints throughout the book, because a method which he uses a lot is essentially he just refers to examples within history that he just so happens to know about. Now, of course, in his Persian letters, he draws a lot of inspiration from these Persian states. And there are also some very interesting references to China.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, within his book, especially I think in the climatology section of his book, he mentions China and how the very fertile lands make people reproduce quite a lot, so that the despot can, I think it was something like, abuse them and still have a lot of people coming without them rebelling against him. It was quite an interesting example. But the problem with his, let's call them Oriental studies, is that he didn't actually travel to many of these Oriental governments. He just heard it, secondhand from people who had traveled there, or from books that he had read and so on, which I think gave him a bad impression and a worse impression than it actually was. Because if his theories were true, things such as, for example, the Persian Empire and so on, which were quite prestigious, should never have been able to rise as they actually did.
So as someone who's very sort of into the Chinese aspect, and two things in mind. One is, of course, that today, and many in China will say that China is simply too big and too diverse for a democracy to
right
there, which is sort of an idea that links effectively into here. But on the other hand, there's a very effective counter-argument here, which China is massive. And
yes.
every single climate type you can imagine exists somewhere in that country.
Yeah, precisely.
And so I wonder, does he ever grapple with the question of empires that transcend climatic zones?
Not really. He doesn't. He just assumes, they should all kind of go along the same lines in the globe. And they should all have an average climate. Yeah. The thing is, that theory actually was kind of maintained up until the creation of the United States, which was a little bit later than his time, I believe. Because, of course,
I think Hegel is also sort of into this idea, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think there's a strong argument to make against it, yet I don't think it's a sort of final argument, because of course you can argue, well, the more area that a state has, the less people will be able to interact with each other, the less they will be able to know about their needs. And of course, there's also something to say about efficiency. How on earth in a democracy do you want to organize the state in a way that everyone's properly represented if you're not doing a direct democracy? Already doing a sort of diluted version of democracy, you still have a little bit of a problem. But of course,
sort of disprove some of that, would you?
Yeah, precisely. There are probably many ways in which, democracy can be implemented. But of course, there are many struggles as well, such as probably representation is the biggest problem, because a single state cannot really handle the needs of everyone at the same time, which is something Switzerland actually, I believe, does quite well, because there's a greater cantonal independence in terms of lawmaking and law executing and so on.
That is actually a feature that was copy-pasted basically from the United States, because it also has a federal system. And so I guess that sort of, there's the solution to that. Basically, federalism, you give autonomy to the local areas.
Yeah, the thing is, these more complex type of governments don't really fit into Montesquieu, unfortunately, because essentially you see them as categorically different, these types of governments. You don't see a sort of scale upon which, on one side there's one person and on the other side there's everyone on a state.
Yeah.
You just see them as categorically different. So you cannot really make this sort of layered system.
Continuous in his sort of ideas. One of his books was, of course, on the greatness and decline of Rome. Now, I don't know exactly how much you've read into that, but as both of us are sort of amateur interested in the Roman Empire, and do you know what his analysis of the fall of Rome is, or what reasons he would state about that? Because I think that always is something interesting that really gives an insight into how some.
I believe he actually does mention, because he does mention Rome quite a bit in his book. Actually, there are some very nice quotes about the corruption of government, which are quite interesting. Essentially, I think he mostly talks about lack of political virtue, and he sees that as the passing from, or one of the passings from, the great Roman Republic to a more weakened Roman Republic, or the beginnings of the empire, and as well size, because it just became way too big.
That's why it couldn't be a republic.
Yeah, of course. Actually, I'm trying to find the quote because it's quite a nice quote, which essentially was made as sort of a warning against corruption, or at least the degeneracy of political virtue, where he says, or he mentions a couple of Roman leaders, Roman emperors, and he says, in these times when there was a bad someone who they saw as a tyrant, they didn't care. They cared about removing the tyrant, but they never cared about removing tyranny. And he sees that probably as one of the main reasons as to why it changed from at least from a republic to a more despotic type of state. But I don't know as to the actual fall of the Roman Empire what he thought.
Well, to me it appears that, unlike Gibbon or something, he places the fall of Rome at the beginning of the empire. Like, it's the degeneration from the republic to the empire that constitutes the fall.
Well, I'm not so sure, because the thing is, at least the nice thing that I believe about Montesquieu is that he thought that any type of government could work as long as you matched it well to the geographical or climatological circumstances of it, and of course that you match the principle to the government. And I don't see why this could not fit with the Roman Empire, because if you have a big state, then just make it sort of despotic. Now, of course, I can see how you can make an argument within Montesquieu that they never truly implemented the principle for despotic states, which interestingly is fear. So essentially, the idea is that the nobles or the people should fear the despot to avoid usurpation. It's quite a funny theory. Essentially, he says, well, when you concentrate so much power in one man, eventually they will become extremely lazy. And once this happens, they'll just, get like a vizier or someone who they'll give power to make the decisions and so on. And then they will start actually making the decisions, where the despot will just sit back and say, wow, governing is so easy. And the idea, of course, is that once this vizier or, whomever, whatever the amount of people actually get some power, have a taste of the despot's power, they will eventually say, hey, I'm doing all the work and I have power. Why am I not the despot? Why can't I reap the benefits out of this if I'm doing the job anyways?
Sneak into the emperor's bedroom at night and do the...
Yeah, precisely.
Meant to be.
Yeah, just unlife him right there and then. Yeah, essentially. So the idea was that everyone feared that the despot would do that.
Them first. The fear of the despot, removing them is what makes them not remove the despot.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, he says something very interesting at some point, where he says something along the lines, the despot should threaten the nobles' necks so that the people can sleep at night, which is quite interesting, I think.
Now, does he have a theory about why, let's say in this case, the political virtue degenerates, and why it's also how it could possibly be created? Because it seems to me that is an important driver of politics for him.
Yes, actually. There are two reasons. One is lack of equality, and the other one is extreme equality. Mm-hmm. Of course, I think lack of equality is kind of fair when one person has way too much power, and then it creates essentially an aristocracy. Because when people become unequal, then there are some people who can rule while others that cannot. So it generates into one of the other ones. And of course, if you have extreme equality, which I think is the more interesting thing, he talks about spirits. So the spirit of extreme equality and the spirit of inequality. In the spirit of extreme equality, people think of themselves as equal, not only as a citizen, so not only in rights and so on, but they also think of themselves equals as in, well, I am equal to the senator, so I should also be able to make those decisions. Oh, I am equal to the head of police, so I should also be able to make those decisions. Oh, I am equal to the head of that family, so I should also be able to make those decisions. So essentially a sort of entitlement in, well, I should be able to decide in everything because there's also someone who is able to decide in certain things. Which, interestingly enough, he believed that it would lead directly to despotism. That there's no other conclusion than if, this is spirit of extreme equality sets in, then despotism will have to be the natural conclusion out of this.
And again, it seems sort of unsurprising for an aristocrat who is better than others to say that the idea that everyone is equal would suboptimal results.
I think I'm willing to give Montesquieu a little bit of credit in the sense that even though, yes, he was quite privileged in his aristocratic position, he did a good job at, representing democracies and as also despotic states and so on. Because he does represent, I think, democracies quite nicely, even though, of course, there's the aspect of people there are logical to a fault. They're essentially like, the Balkans of Star Trek or something like that. He does describe them as logical, as free, as probably the most intellectually gifted and toughest people of them all. Also, interestingly enough, he has a theory of alcohol and why the people from the north drink much more alcohol than the people from the south. Yeah, and essentially it all leads back to this climatological idea where, the people with the tougher fibers need much more to get drunk. So they are allowed to drink much, much more than the people from the south who with one sip already indulge in all their pleasures.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yes, and thus we will see in a couple of years when everyone returns to their natural states how the Finnish became the drunkest people on the planet, essentially.
Well, interestingly, I wonder if he were alive today what he would say about the fact that the Finnish consume the most coffee per capita these days, as do a lot of...
Do they actually?
Yeah, a lot of the Nordic countries.
No way.
Consumers per capita. So maybe they need some sort of stimulant to awake them out of their sort of
right
drunk, which would make them even
yeah, because I think the highest beer or at least alcohol consumption per capita is Portugal for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think that that seems pretty much the wrong way around.
Yeah, it really does.
Maybe it goes back to sort of the ancient Roman idea of the drunken barbarian or something like that.
Yeah, it might be actually.
Probably drank.
Yeah, though it can also be, a little bit different because maybe it is the case that people in the south, even though they drink more moderately. At least that's something I can tell from personal experience.
Oh, yeah?
Now, though, of course, personal experience is never a very good argument. I mean, from what I have been able to tell, people, at least in Europe, who are more from, Central Europe or Northern Europe, they drink, of course, on average, they drink less, but they don't space it out. So when you drink, you just get in Northern Germany and so on, while people in the south drink much more.
Every day, right? And
yeah, precisely. So it brings the average up. But they never get to a level where they are, they completely lost all inhibitions. They always remain at a moderate level, which Montesquieu would love, of course, with his moderation.
Yeah, that's drink moderate.
Maybe Montesquieu was Portuguese at heart.
Yeah, he should have gone often a bit further.
Yeah,
west, and he would have said that would be the optimal. Optimal government.
Yeah, precisely.
I want to sort of come now to the question of what is the most based thing that Montesquieu
the most base thing that Montesquieu said, I would say it has to be the climatological thing. I mean, just the idea that, some states are... No, actually, well, I mean, it's halfway the climatological idea, because I think the nice thing about it is that, yeah, it's not just that democracy is the greatest, political system of all time, but, maybe if you have a really enlightened despot, you can really make it work. And I really like that about him.
Fair enough. What's the cringiest thing he said?
Probably the other side of that coin, that it must be like the northern barbarians and the southern barbarians, and us French people, the more moderate of them all. We have the greater genes and the greater capability. Well, probably I think it has to also probably go along the lines of how he misrepresented all the great empires that have been, and all the great civilizations that have been in a little bit more, let's call it, warmer climate, because there has been like pretty great stuff. Like the Islamic Golden Age is nothing to be ignored. And
empire from where you're from, I wouldn't even exactly call that a warm temperature place, because it's the mountains and making it.
Yeah, maybe we have a French temperature, and that's why it was so great.
Yeah, but not an air oxygen content.
Yeah, oxygen deprived. Damn, that's why we couldn't be the Spanish. Damn. Yeah. Though, hold on. I think the combination between the European influence and the America, or let's call it the Inca or indigenous influence, make the true current American, which is the true moderate, because you go all the way from North Mexico, go through the equator, go all the way to the south. And it just averages out into, average French temperature or something. And that's why nowadays South America is the best country. Okay, let's not get that. I'm still waiting for San Martin to go out of his grave, as well as Simon Bolivar. In the time of the greatest need, like Merlin or something, come out of a tree. Yeah. Yeah, and then Montesquieu will come and say, no, but they have... Oh my God. Yeah, no.
Changing things.
But my book.
No. But guys, like, Oriental must always be despotic.
Yeah, no, but then when you have to say, oh my God, they are the most Western of them all. Oh my God, guys, that's why their government is so great. I think that would be the true, Montesquieu idea.
You far enough east, you end up west.
Shh, they don't know that. Don't make your listeners that educated.
Yeah, true. That's top secret.
Yeah. Only rectangle maps are allowed in this house.
With the Mercator projection, 100% correct.
Yeah. That's why the United States and Canada and Russia are so despotic in comparison to the true, chatness of the Brazilian Empire and the Peruvian state and so on.
With his attempt.
Yeah, precisely.
All right. Before we close out, I want to ask you. I want to do a segment about recommendations. And I'm going to start by recommending the Cautionary Tales podcast by Tim Harford. It is another podcast almost as good as my own, I must add, and it's about stories that warn you not to make certain mistakes, or sort of, cautionary tales, as it says on the tin. Do you have anything you'd recommend to the audience, be it anything, really?
Oh, I would highly recommend the Persian Letters. It doesn't matter whether you're into philosophy or political theories or political science or not. But anyway, you can both enjoy it and probably learn a lot, both about Montesquieu as about politics. It's quite a fascinating, I think, tale, and it's quite nicely written. It's essentially, literary wise, it's written as a sort of collection of. It is the correspondence between these travelers who go to France and see Europe in this, let's call it Oriental lens. It's also a little bit of a satire as to how French culture was at that time. I do remember that at one point, I think he pointed out that women had something different to wear every day because the fashion changed so rapidly that there was really no one day where you could wear the same thing or something similar. It's quite fun. It's quite fun. And
Yeah, okay.
yeah. And probably, especially at the very beginnings, or at least closer to the beginning than to the end of the story, you have a very special, I think, part of the book called or at least I call it the Tale of the Troglodytes, where essentially, I think it's Uzbek, if I recall, who narrates this political, very heavily politically induced tale as to the state of troglodytes, and it talks about the corruption of the state, its transformation. It talks a lot about political virtue, and I think you can probably tell most of Montesquieu's political theories just out of that fragment. It's what
folks, guys. The Spirit of the Laws is not the book you should be reading. Pick yourself a copy of the book.
Pick the Persian letters between those 10 pages. That's all you need, and then you get a PhD in modern political theory. Yeah. Yeah, precisely.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Our producer is Constantina. Our guest today was Alessandro, and I am, as always, hopefully, your host, Darius.